My name's Larry Pearsall, and I'm here to talk to Jim Cambronne. I've been a friend of Jim's and an admirer of his work for about 50 years, I believe, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to us. Now, Jim, you've had a storied career, but one of your early, really significant paintings was Salon of Mysteries, which is right next to us here. And before we talk about your career as it went along, maybe you could talk to us briefly about this painting.
Well, this painting was, a commission, and I was trying to make my living as a young artist in Sioux Falls, and I had been working as a sign painter and also as a cartoonist, and then I was able to just start making my own work. And something I didn't know at the time, but it turned out in my favor, was that every small city across the country can support a few different artists. And turns out Sioux Falls could support one or two. And what was happening was I couldn't really get any work as a young artist because a lot of the best artists at that time were teaching in the universities and colleges. And so what happened were a lot of projects would come up that were either too low pay or not interesting enough for the other artists that were more experienced. And so they'd just say, "Oh, Jim, he's working full-time as an artist. Go over there, see if he'd be interested in doing it." And so a number of my early projects came to me that way. And then, of course, just like everybody, you make friends. And I was involved in both the Boy Scouts and in my youth fellowship, and I was a state leader in both. And I met a lot of people from across the state, and one of the people I met was a young man named Jeff Wirt, and he was working for, I believe at the time, Spitznagel Partners. And he and I worked on 3 different projects, and he had gotten the job to design the interior of the Lafayette restaurant and bar. And he was particularly working on the bar and had asked me if I'd submit some proposals to the owners for this, what turned out to be this painting. So that's how that began. And
Well, that talks about how it began.
mm-hmm.
Do you want to describe anything about the painting, the allegories? What little bit, without going into a lot of detail, just to get us into the painting a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, the painting is I think the major idea in the painting is using various objects and time frames and ways of coming to representation. So in some of the painting there are pictures taken from photographs. In some cases there's a person painted from life, like over here on the couch. That was, I didn't have the couch, and so the couch actually comes from a photograph, but the woman sleeping on the couch, of course, is very real. And she came up to the upstairs of the old courthouse museum where I was painting this painting. And I think I just had a bench, and she put her head down with a pillow on the bench and just fall asleep. And I drew her, and later took some color notes and then painted her later. But that came from life, and then other things were from photographs and different time periods. So I'm mixing all of those different forms together into a single fiction.
Well, it's my understanding that you're going to shortly retire from your positions at the University Art Department in Boston, and that you're going to devote full time then, once again, to your paintings, which is great. Before we go and talk about the current project that you have, maybe you could talk a little bit about the path your art career has taken up to this point.
Well, I guess, in high school, I'll just start there and I'll just go pretty quickly. In high school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to be, and I thought I wanted to be an astronomer. That was kind of what was leading me, so most of my education was oriented towards math and science. And then I would have been able to graduate at 17, but I was too afraid, and from a relatively poor family, and didn't know how to get to college. So I could talk about, the influences in my life that helped me. I think everybody has someone that helps. So I decided to stay on another year or two at school, and I thought I'd like to take some art courses. And I did, and I had a really wonderful teacher. And how it all started, where I started to get serious, was I started with a kind of a terrible thing that actually happened. My parents were not really able to provide food for us, and most of it was things that at the time my father was, catching fish, and so it was like fish and spaghetti, and I kind of went on my own little rebellion. Like I didn't think I was going to eat any more fish and spaghetti, and I passed out in the cafeteria at school because I didn't have any food to take to school. So I just was walking through there and I passed out. And our high school counselor happened to be Donna S. Brown, who was a person who was helped found the South Dakota Art Museum. And she was best friends with Muriel Humphrey. And so Donna Brown talked to the art teacher, and he said, this kid's really talented. And so she kind of took me on as a mentor. And the next year, there was a national painting competition that Hallmark Cards used to sponsor. And 20,000 entries. A winner from each state got to go to be in a show in Kansas City at the corporate headquarters, I guess. And I got 4th place in that. And that came with a modest scholarship to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And a friend of mine in the art department said she was thinking about going to Augustana, and maybe I should come too. And I thought, okay, that sounds good. So I came down and interviewed with Carl. Grew up at Augustana, and I loved what he had to say. And then I started digging in and saw that Carl and Palmer Heidi here were, really true artists, and that I maybe didn't have to go to Chicago. I was a little afraid to do that. And so I came to Augustana. That's how I got here. And my friend Cheryl didn't show up. She went to the university, and I guess the reason may be that the university was a little more economical thing, a way to go. And my advisor back in Huron said, just, it was different than donuts, don't worry about the money, and somehow it'll come your way. And it did. I got scholarships and got some good jobs in Sioux Falls related to art. And when I came back to Sioux Falls, after finishing at Augustana, I came back to Sioux Falls and started as resident artist at the Siouxland Heritage Museums. From there, I went to graduate school at Yale University School of Art. And I was a little bit intimidated. Some of my classmates are exceptionally famous artists today. Some of the students I had there too are as well. And what happened after my first year, the director of graduate studies came and asked me if I'd be interested in teaching. And I had just gotten married, and I talked to my wife about it, and I said, well, I never I never decided wanted to be a teacher. My parents thought it would be a good idea to get an art education degree, and I told them, well, to fall back on. And they said, well, if I have something to fall back on, I'll fall back on it. So I decided not to go that direction, and so this opportunity arose. And they said, we're interested. So I said, okay, I'll just tell them I'm interested. She said, yeah, that's a good idea. See what happens, what they have in mind. And the director of graduate studies came and talked to me and said, we think you are a gifted teacher, and we'd like to offer you a full-time job teaching here for 2 years, give you some experience. And so I went from doing that, and then I had for 2 years, and then I had an opportunity to teach in California. Also simultaneous with that, I was in a major show of new talent in Boston, and then I was also in a traveling show that toured in England, in like 3 or 4 different venues in England. And I went to California to Cal Arts and was a part of the first faculty for the California High School for the Arts. And then when I came back, I moved to Maine. My wife stayed in New Haven and did some house sitting, and my new son. And then we moved up to Maine, and we were there 10 years. And while I was there, I did a artist residency at Anderson Ranch in Colorado, and taught almost two jobs at once. One semester at Bowdoin College for a sabbatical, fill in, plus kept my full-time job at Maine College of Art. And then my wife finally was able to go to grad school. She had been ill for a while, and we decided to go to California, and she went to Mills College, which is a women's college, but it's really pretty well known for visual arts and dance and theater and education. So she went to grad school there, and I taught at the first term at University of California, Berkeley, and then at San Francisco Art Institute, and then I kind of held 2 positions for a year. I don't know how I did all this, but at Portland State University, I filled in for a year for their senior artist who was on sabbatical. And somehow during that time I had my first shows in New York City at Tibor Denage Gallery, and in San Francisco at Paula Anglem Gallery, and then in Boston at Nielsen Gallery. And then I had just started showing in a really good gallery in Maine where I was living at Icon Gallery. So 4 shows really quickly, and you know, at some certain point, the pay was really low at the Art Institute. They probably hate me for saying that, but I had to find a decent paying job, so I applied for a few schools and was a finalist at 3 of them, and I took the job at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. So I've been there, and I've been showing, you know, both in New York and San Francisco and Maine and in Boston. So now I'm almost done, so I'm going to plan to stay on the East Coast, I think, and devote all my time to my work.
Well, you're almost done in terms of teaching.
Yeah, but not done in terms of being an artist. No.
Far from it, we hope.
Right.
You mentioned the name of somebody that was a mutual friend of ours, Carl Rupp. Mm-hmm. And of course, maybe you would like to say a little more about the influences that he had on your art.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of, when you think about it, he sort of like introduced me to what it meant to be a serious artist. And I know when I was finishing at Yale, one of their major artists and teachers there three of them gave me advice. I asked them for advice about teaching, and Melvin Bachner said to me that one of the primary things you do as an art teacher is you are one example of how to be an artist. Not the example, but one example. And that was what Carl did. He wasn't heavy-handed in what you did or who you turned out to be, but he showed you how to be an artist. And I was lucky to come to Augustana rather than maybe school, the Art Institute of Chicago, where I'm sure the teachers, because of the number of students that they had and how they had to go about, balancing their careers as artists with their teaching, I would never have been able to get a look on the inside of what it meant to be an artist. And so Carl was just really good at, encouraging us all to immerse ourselves in art, that we weren't, visual art was more expansive than just visual art, that we were connected to all the artists. And at the time, Augustana, I thought, had a really great foundations program. I didn't know that at the beginning because I didn't know anything, but I think University of Chicago had a similar program. And the idea was that in the foundations courses, they linked all the other fields of study together. So in my physics class, there was a whole section on Kandinsky. And the same was true in all the other, like sociology, all those other courses too. So it was a kind of a great grounding for an artist, at least this artist. I'm not sure everybody took to it, but we had. And also I was talking to my peer here, John Peters, who I knew from that time, who teaches at Augustana. We were fortunate to be with a really great group of other young artists. And we were a small group, but we spent a lot of time with each other, talking about things and learning that a lot of the education doesn't take place in the classroom, but takes place between each other in the study groups, or just talking about things we don't understand that maybe we learn, trying to figure out how it applies to us or the world. So Carl was really just good in opening up his life to his son. I don't think all students, but students that were interested, he would be able to have a personal relationship with him.
What about, my understanding is that you have a great regard for the continuity of art, both in instruction as well as in maybe the performance of art. Do you want to talk something about the continuity?
Sure. I'm going to say something that hit me at graduate school at Yale, and then come back to Augustana and talk about that, and then bring it back forward again. So, first day I was at Yale, they got all of the graduate school students together, and they said two or three really important things. But the thing that struck me, that resonated with what I learned at Augustana, and that I knew from being out and practicing as an artist in Sioux Falls professionally, was that the dean of the school at that time, David Pease, said, "You can't do this alone, and you need each other." And he said, what we hope that you will do, or expect what you will do, is to put your egos behind you and be kind and supportive to one another, because when you get into the world, you're going to need each other. So if something happens for you and you can't do it, you pass it on to one of your classmates, or part of your, not necessarily your classmates, but part of your artistic family, the people that you know and work with. And that was one of the things that Carl, I think, exhibited, going back to what Bachner said as a role model, is he created community. And that is something that Sioux Falls and the state have really benefited from. And some of the younger artists probably haven't had that connection with Carl, but some of the people that he influenced are some of the institutions that are here. He was part of, getting going, but just creating this idea that if we need to be mutually supportive of one another. And so later, and Carl used to say this all the time too, was that it's like always trying to make connections across disciplines and within disciplines, and even within your own thinking. And so, like, how did you go about creating something? He was very good about showing us how an artist thought and what was underneath the thing that you're going to do. So it's sort of that old story about you can get much farther if you teach somebody how to fish rather than giving them the fish. And Carl was about teaching you how to get the fish more than he was about giving it to you. And so then back at Yale, we're talking about, and then one of the deans there, Andrew Forge, I didn't hear the lecture, but I had it reported to me, and then he was one of my mentors there at Yale, and we talked about what I'd heard. So he didn't give me the whole thing, but he talked to me in this way and said that, the study of art, no matter what art it is, but particularly in visual art, goes back all the way, caves and before. And this is one of the only professions in the world that has an unbroken continuity between that era and now. And even though we may think that in Middle Ages or this or that, it's been broken, it really hasn't. And so he said, what I mean by that is that we are passing down the information that we've learned and the information that we have developed from one generation to the next. And that some of the people that you're passing it on to is like a seed, and it will take and sprout. And others will just pass by. But this information that we're learning here, you have a responsibility to keep it going, of transferring your knowledge to the other. So the famous lecture that I'm referring to here that I heard about that Andrew gave was he decided to do kind of like what it does in the Bible, and with all of the begats, who begat who. And so he engineered it backwards. And because of his, brilliance, his knowledge of art history, and as a researcher and as a historian, he traced for the students back from himself all the way to Leonardo da Vinci, where in a sense that, this person, I studied with this person, who studied with this person, who studied with this person, who studied with this person, all the way back along those lines. And he said, that's an example of how what I'm talking to you about operates. How everybody's like moving this thing forward. So a few years ago, there was published a book, and they had finally gathered or collected a translation in English of Da Vinci's writings. And I'm reading through Da Vinci's writings, and I'm sorry I can't quote anything exactly specifically, But I'm reading through there, and I'm reading Carl said this, Carl said that, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, almost verbatim. And I'm going like, how does this happen? And the only really explanation is how we're kind of passing these things down from one artist to another. So as the bards or the fila or the griots, passing the collective information from one artist to another, that's how this continuity gets, extended. Another thing that I thought was interesting about that was how I was experiencing it myself there. So the idea that, I guess it was a game with Kevin Bacon or something, how many degrees of separation are you from Kevin Bacon? So the first time I became aware of that question was when I was teaching at Maine College of Art, and someone said, yeah, the 6 degree separation thing is real. And I said, oh, I don't know if I believe that. And my colleague said, okay, well, just name somebody, Jim, we'll see. And I said, I really thought hard. I said, okay, Albert Einstein. And the guy across the table who teaches with me was the furniture teacher. He says, Jamie Johnston, he says, my wife knows Albert Einstein. And I went, what? And she said, yeah, her dad taught physics at Princeton, and Albert Einstein used to come over to the house to faculty dinners and play with her when she was a little kid. How about that? So then I started thinking about it back in terms of my own life, and then I realized, Palmer Eide, who taught here, started the art program, he studied with Walter Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus, directly. He studied with Herbert Bayer, who is basically the communication design teacher at the Bauhaus. He studied painting in Chicago, at the Chicago, Illinois campus, with the painter and designer Mohaly Nagy. He studied architecture, graduate architecture, at the same campus with Mies van der Rohe. And one of his best friends was the scholar, the British Indian scholar Adnan Coomaraswamy, who started the major Asian art collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. They carried on a lifelong correspondence. He was friends with Eero Saarinen and with, all of a sudden I forgot my favorite architect. I always do that. Maybe I can come back to it. And he also he started at Yale, and he started with George Kubler, who had just retired when I went to Yale, who is the major expert on Mayan art, and who wrote The Shape of Time, which was was a major influence on me before I went to graduate school. And so there's and then Carl, he's studied with we share one teacher in common. We studied with at Yale, and that person studied with Albers, and so that's 1 degree there. And then one of his teachers was a student of Max Beckmann's and Ben Shawn, and what was the other? Philip Guston. So Carl is like only 1 degree away from these people. So the two, in the Western European art, there's 2 trees. There's many more trees than that come from China, Africa, India, Japan, that are all kind of branching out, and we have cross-references between them. So Carl's really from one of the trees, but he has a teacher that we share together that's from this Da Vinci tree. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to think of, okay, we're part of a big family, that we're not necessarily blood relatives, but we're relatives in the sense that wisdom is and technique and ideas are being passed from generation to generation.
You know, the written art history and the written instruction materials and so on are one thing, but how much of the art history that is being passed down that you're talking about is oral and visual?
And a lot of it is actually. So, in relationship to that, one of my teachers at Yale in printmaking was Gabor Paterdi. And Gabor Paterdi is an interesting figure in American art and also European art. So Gabor was the son of, I'm told, I don't know this for a fact, but I was told that his mother was like the Mark Twain of Hungary. So he was sent as a 10-year-old to Italy to study art. So by the time he was 17, he was through his art studies, he moved to Paris. And Gabor started in the print shop that Stanley Hayter had formed there called Atelier 17, which was kind of both a school and a professional workshop and a studio. And Gabor, as a young artist there, met some of the new artists also coming that were a little bit older than him, coming from Europe. So his best friends were Juan Miro, Marc Chagall, and Max Ernst. Those were his buddies. And as our young artist in the workshop, one of the stories that he told me, so this is him passing down knowledge to me, and he taught in the oral tradition. He wasn't like classically or like trained. And so some of the younger students at Yale when I was there were having a hard time with him. He was like near retirement. But they'd say, well, he comes to my studio and he looks around very quickly, and he sits down in a chair and he tells me a series of stories. And it doesn't seem, I can't figure out how it all relates to what my work is. And so I had Gabor too at the same time in a graduate print seminar. And some of the younger artists who wanted to have more direct information, they stopped coming to class. So and Gabor wasn't one of the teachers that would just leave class, like I've seen that over my career. Well, the people get started and then they leave and they come back. Gabor would stay the whole time. So after a while, I kept coming to class, and so it would be just Gabor and me, and he'd be telling me stories while I worked almost the whole time. So one of those stories he told me that was related to what we're talking about was that when he was a young artist working in the print shop, Pablo Picasso was coming to the print shop to make prints, and they would print them there, and sometimes he would work there. At one point, Picasso decided he just didn't have the time or desire to come over to that print shop and work. He wanted to work at home. And he asked Stanley Hayter, he said, I would like to do this, but I have this like set of tools, and then I work with them so vigorously, they get dull. And then I have to come back here and, have you sharpen them for me. And Gabor told me that Stanley Hayter said to him, well, we got two options, Pablo. You can learn how to sharpen your tools, or we can have Gabor sharpen them for you. And he said, what we'll do is we'll go out and get you 20 of everything. And Gabor will sharpen them for you, and then you can go and you can work probably a couple months on that, the way you're working, so quickly and rapidly. So I said, okay, that sounds good. And so Gabor got assigned to Picasso as like his guy to sharpen tools. He thought, well, I'll sharpen his tools, I'll probably not even see him. Well, when Picasso would come for his tools, he would do just what Gabor was doing with me. He sat down beside him for almost, to sharpen that many tools, about 4 hours worth of work. sit there for 4 hours with Gabor and talk to him about art and life, for I think a course of 5 or 6 years. So that was like one of the stories that Gabor told me. But it's kind of, Eide did the same thing in his modern art history class, because he was, like I had mentioned earlier, had worked with all these different people, studied with them, but also in some cases worked with them actually on projects together. Like Eide worked at Cranbrook with Saarinen, and I think Palmer told me that he designed the sidewalks and things, or pathways at Cranbrook. And he'd go there in the summer, and that's how he met Dalrymple, Palmer Eide. But so this kind of idea of, things passing on, and then just like the stories, kind of what they do, oral history. My grandfather taught me that way. And so when Gabor started telling me stories, I was open to his listening to someone that was kind of like a griot or a bard or a fila, like the Irish types of poets, and that was passing on, knowledge and information. And so I knew that I didn't need to take what he was talking to me literally. What I had to do was I had to understand exactly why it was he was telling me this story, why he thought it was important that I hear this at this point in time, and to try to then extrapolate and apply it to my work. And having my grandfather for all those years teaching me that way, it seemed natural to me, where it didn't actually to my peers. And so there are other stories that he told too. I could relay some of them.
We'd like to hear them, because these stories, they become less exact, and so doing something like you're doing right now helps the stories to live on, because there's some exactness to it. So if you have others, we'd love to hear them.
Well, I'll tell a few of them. And I'd use the same technique in teaching. And a few years ago, one of the other Dakota artists, I think I may be the only South Dakota artist that has gone to Yale, but there's been a few from North Dakota. And one of them is a person who's been in charge of printmaking and head of painting, and then a dean, and then several other roles, Nancy Freese, who's from North Dakota. And according to her grandfather, one of her grandfathers, our great-grandfather, was one of the people that developed meteorology and was one of the kind of world experts on that at the time. So Nancy still comes out to South Dakota. They still have property out here, the homestead up in North Dakota, and she paints here. So Nancy was kind of talking to me about, some of the same things that we've been talking about here, about how things are connected and interrelated and through oral history. So everyone has, sort of like, say there's the collection of the parables in the Bible, or there's a set of stories that you maybe collect. Like Carl had a set of stories, and every once in a while you get a new one, and that would be exciting, at least for me, to hear a new story. And this collection is a little bit like, say, though I was talking earlier about this painting today, Degas' portfolio of drawings, his 50 drawings that he made a lot of his paintings from. And so this collection of stories, like you have as a teacher, you may have a portfolio of stories. And once in a while, in order for you to bring a piece of information to life, you want to try to connect it to a person or to an event rather than it is just dry, literal information. And so those stories kind of become your kind of avenue to bring, what you're doing to life. Make it connect to the world around you. And that's really at the bottom line of what's the most important thing about fine art, no matter what art practice discipline you do, is it's about making connections. And so you want to learn how to connect with yourself, connect with an audience, connect with other people, connect with your materials, and your tools. And so the story, is when I went to speak to Nancy Friese, had a graduate class in teaching. And she invited me to come and talk about the role stories have in teaching, and how they help to establish empathy, which is one of the 4 really important components of creative imagination, which are like fantasy, like imagining unusual or different connections between things or across things. Empathy is the ability to identify with or project yourself into the thing that you're doing or connect with it in a very personal way or with another person and their ideas. In other words, to communicate, seeing the general and the whole, like seeing what's the thing underneath that unites it, everything together. So like in a painting like this, like what is the through line, the stick that connects the contrasting poles that you might be using to make it visual. And the other is the particular of establishing what makes you unique. And like as a young artist, that's what you're really concentrated on. How am I different from my parents? How am I different from my peers? How am I different, or what makes me who I am? And so you're all about pulling that out to see who you are in particular, and that's what you're doing in a work of art. You can make a really wonderful abstract composition, but if it doesn't have any specificity to it, any particularity to it, it doesn't have any resonance. It just acts as a pretty thing, like a decorative thing. And vice versa, if you're working from very specific information, that too has its problems. And so then you're trying to understand for yourself, like what is the through line, what's the thing that connects all of that, makes it, holds it together. So these stories, when you're telling them, and that's what Carl did, was he brought things to life. And some of the stories that I have some of my own set of stories. Like one story that I tell is that when I was working at the Pettigrew Museum here, I was in a room painting the dining room, and there was a white wall. And I was in that room through the change of the maybe 2 seasons, 6 months about. And I go there every day and paint. I was painting only about this big. It's incredibly detailed, as you might imagine. And as I sat there, I watched the white wall, and not watched it, but really saw it. And I realized that the wall was all of the spectrum. The white was, all the colors in the spectrum. I started to see things that I hadn't seen before because I was paying attention and seeing. So here at Augustana, something happened to me, and it's a story I tell. Is my friend, Stuart Evenson, was a composition major and a musician, and his composition teacher was a composer, Icelandic composer, I think was just here for a short period of time, named Jan Jansson. And so Jan Jansson was lying on the grass, which I guess is going to be a lake, just hanging out, and Stuart said, "Let's go talk to Jan. I want you to meet him." So we went over and sat on the grass, and we were talking, a little chit-chat for a little while, and then Jan says to me, and Stuart, he says, "Can you hear it?" And we looked at each other, and we go, like, what? Like the wind? And we named off a few things, and he just goes, no. He said, "Listen more closely and more carefully." So we listened for about 5 minutes, and we both looked like, no, I can't hear anything. And then what is he talking about? It must be something. And so he asked us to do this about 3 times. And then we said, we don't understand what you're, and he says, "What are you asking us to listen to?" He said, "The grass growing." And for, it sounds like a kind of a flip thing, but for an artist, that was like one of the most major pieces of information that I'd ever gotten, was that the picture is not just a picture. A white wall is not just a white wall, which is a generalization that you do. You have all this specific information, and then you have to put some of it aside or you go crazy. But what you do as an artist is you re-examine these things and you reanimate them or reimagine them in a sum for your fellow human beings, so that they understand that if they took a little bit of time or they slowed down, they might be able to see something they hadn't seen before, or they'd forgotten that they'd seen before, and it would connect to them in a different time and place in a new and more powerful way. So that's a story that I a lot of times will tell students if I want them to pay more attention to what they're seeing. They might be just like doing this, like look at that more carefully. Like, just don't, name it so fast. Another story I sometimes tell is a more personal one, and I tell it to students when I'm trying to explain to them that there's a difference between bringing something to life as art experientially, or by talking about it or telling it in a more maybe intellectual way. And so my wife Nancy had gotten a full scholarship to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, which is kind of a renowned summer program, and they have great teachers there. Sometimes they even have Nobel Prize winners teaching. So she was there in a good summer and with great, amazing classmates, like something like 4,000 people apply for 25 positions or 45 positions. So it's a worldwide, people of different levels of education and practice. So she's there with a wonderful artist, from California, and they're both mothers. And so they recent mothers, and so they challenge each other to make a work about what it feels like to be a mother and loving and love and all of the that goes into that care thing. So Nancy's partner in this equation, she makes this wonderful piece. She had an experience with her child where she almost lost her child. So she gets a child's bed and she makes an installation. She has the child's bed. She gets all the accoutrements around the bed, and then she has like a plate where when her child was really sick, she would take and chew his food, and very similar to, like I say, a bird or another animal might feed their young that way. And so this wasn't a performance, but all these different things were there, and you could kind of, if you were doing a forensic study, you might be able to put all the clues together about what actually was happening here. Nancy's decided to take a completely different approach. So she and I were both, even though I was a grad student, she was doing all this work at Yale with me. And she also has a master's degree in psychology and a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in theater. And so she decides that she's going to make this experiential. And what she decides to do is she starts thinking about, I think, drawing upon her Catholic background, the swaddling clothes, the swaddling of a baby, of like that wrapping around with the blanket when they're young and keeping them close, and they feel safer. And then they feel confined later, but in the beginning, safer. So she takes her whole studio, she gets this extremely long length and quite wide piece of cheesecloth, and she basically creates a hammock from, attached to one wall and to the other wall. And it creates this beautiful white arc. There's a skylight in the studio, so the light reflects off the arc up onto the walls. It's just kind of the serene thing. Then she decides that, so the idea was to swaddle the viewer. So you would climb into this thing, so like a hammock, and you would be enfolded, and then you would also have the opportunity of swinging. But that wasn't all of it, so then she took and she painted. She decided to reverse, which is a kind of a poetic thing, the sky and the ground. So she painted the floor blue, like the color of the sky, and above she strung another, but only flat this time, hammock across the whole space, a arc across the space. And then she gathered this beautiful pink grass that was out in the fields at Skowhegan. She sat out there almost like when I saw her and our son out in the field, it reminded me of a Harvey Dunn painting or something. They were in the field gathering the pink grass, and then they filled it, not really thick, but so you could see through it. The whole top of the thing was with the pink grass. So when you actually experienced this piece, you felt like you were completely transported in space and time. And so the feeling came across more like what she was trying to communicate was experiential, so the feeling became embodied. And the other one, the feeling stayed, the idea stayed in the mind. And both of them are beautiful, acceptable ways to work. But when I'm trying to get a student to actually think about the feeling of something rather than the thinking of something, I tell them that story about how you both work, but one seems more engaging with the audience. Everybody that saw the piece wanted to participate and get in that hammock and did.
So that's really an installation. Which of course the art world is opened up to.
Right. I do a lot of them too. I haven't done a lot of them, but I've done 4 major ones. And one was at Anderson Ranch called Tonus, and I just did one not so long ago called Where What Is, and it also takes on both of them actually take on some of the things I explored in here in the painting that we just talked about. So it's a kind of where what is set up like a narrative journey, but in space. And so each kind of station of the cross kind of idea, even though I'm not Catholic, I don't really understand what that is. But it's an idea that at each station, as you move through, like you have different kind of sections here, as you move through, a different sort of philosophical or existential question is asked of you, visually. And the other one, Tonus, out in, Colorado, in Snowmass Village, was really also included sound, and it was actually, part of it was also sort of connected to a story that John Cage told about, which I've later learned might not be accurate, but it still works because it's really interesting. So he went to Harvard, and his main interest was silence. So, and actually John Cage was introduced to me by the person of the story, it's Jan Janssen here at Yale, at Augustana. So he gave me all this stuff about Janssen, about Cage, and also he introduced me to electronic music. But anyway, Cage went to Harvard, and they had an anechoic chamber there. He wanted to experience this, and apparently if you go in there, you're not supposed to be able to hear any sound. So he went in there and he experienced it as he tells it, and he came out of the anechoic chamber and he spoke to the technician, and he said, it's not silent in there. I heard sound. And the technician said to him, well, what did you hear? He said, I heard a high-pitched sound, and I heard a low-pitched sound, like rushing. That was like rushing, like a low-pitched sound. Oh, and the technician said, oh, that's easy. He said, the high-pitched sound is the sound of your nervous system, and the low-pitched sound is your blood rushing through your body, moving through your body. And that was a little bit like the grass thing. It's like, oh, so if all the sound is taken away and all you have left is like silence, like Octavio Paz would say, is full of noise. And, so I love that story, and it became part of the basis for the thinking of the installation I did in Colorado. So Larry, one of the stories also that I like to tell was relayed to me by my colleague at Maine College of Art, Jonathan Aldrich. And as a child, about 14-year-old, I guess that's not much of a child, but Jonathan was in a used bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he was born, and the poet Robert Frost also lived there at the time. And he was in there alone, and Robert Frost actually came into the store, and they struck up a conversation and became friends. And then Robert Frost, when Jonathan was a little older, started inviting him to Bread Loaf, where he was Robert Frost's assistant during the summers. Later, he also was hired by the family to kind of observe and watch Robert in his elder years, so that he wouldn't fall and wouldn't have any assistance, but he liked to walk alone. And so Jonathan was asked to stay hidden from Robert's view as they walked. And the way Jonathan tells it, was after 2 years of this, they were walking, and he thought he was being pretty sly, and Robert couldn't see him. And one day, Robert just stopped in the middle of the path and turned around and looked at Jonathan and said, Jonathan, I can see you. He says, why don't you just come up here and walk with me? And so after that date, Jonathan didn't hide from me, just walked along with him. When Jonathan assisted Robert Frost, a story that really stuck with me, rather than that more anecdotal story, was Jonathan said that Robert's class at Bread Loaf, of course, all of the poets wanted to be in the class, and so they had to find a way to limit the enrollment. So Robert Frost decided that he would interview all of the people who wanted to be in the class. And Jonathan said that he was in the room when these interviews took place, and he took notes for Robert Frost about what people said. And Robert Frost asked the same question each time. And the question was, what will break your heart if you found out it wasn't true? And when I think back on, my life as an artist, and I think about that question, I understand why that question would be so effective in beginning to, track with who would be a good student for you and who might not be. Because the way that you answer that question, I think, would give you a lot of information about the values someone might have and what they really care about in terms of their feelings. That might be a good way to sort of lead into talking a bit about my own personal work, the project I've been working on. And we brought up poetry, and it's a nice springboard from Robert Frost and kind of thinking about poetry. So as we've talked, I haven't said this directly, but I discovered at a certain point that in my interest in semiotics and some of the other things I've talked about today, is that I was interested in poetry and the idea that language can be a way to, or is the way to maybe speak about, the things I'm interested in. So, for example, in some of my discussion today, I've talked about how I'm combining all these different signs and symbols and artifacts and, things from different time periods, present and past, and maybe future, and putting them all into the same space. I learned while I was a grad student, someone said, the artist that is really like you, that you should read, is the Argentinian writer Luis Borges. And I resisted reading Borges for a long time, but then I finally did, and I said, why did I do that? So his idea of mixing kind of fact and fiction into a short, beautiful form where a new kind of reality would come into existence is something that I was interested in. So my new work actually, instead of using signs and symbols or images, and images can be words, like they're visual words, I use actually visual languages from other cultures. So like I might be mixing things, not quoting like a good postmodernist might, but I'm using things from, say, the South Dakota here, the Native American art. I'm looking at say, de style, like a Dutch abstraction or suprematism, Persian carpets, Indo painting, like miniatures, and the list, Jain painting, tantric painting, and the list could go on across many different cultures. And in the paintings, what I do is I'm also using this idea of like setting things into three. So like there was a Matisse painting I saw. It was in a vertical form, but it was three bands. And so I started thinking about that in my Western experience, moving across spaces, the idea of a zone, like a time zone, and like what would happen if you, just thinking about it, it's like you get up in the morning and you're in one space in your bedroom, you get your clothes on, you're in maybe another space like in your living room, or you're eating breakfast, you walk out the door and you're in another space, then you're in a transportation space, or you're walking or whatever you're doing, then you're at work, in the space you are, like say for you in the court, in your office, and then in the courtroom. And as you move across that space, you're the one thing that's constant, because it's your psyche and it's you moving through the space. And you actually are affecting the space as you walk through it. You're at least moving the air. And the space is actually affecting you as you move through it. And so it's a little bit like, in simple terms, like Joseph Albers running a single color through 3 different bands of color. And as it moves through those bands of color, it changes sometimes value and hue, depending on how the color it's interacting with. And so the same happens to an individual, or the same might happen, like with you in a trial, or it might happen like with having a conversation with your friends or one another or your family. And so there's this interesting thing that I'm trying to speak about that takes on a different kind of model in this project that I'm calling the Days of May. There's a painting for each day in May, and it's a single piece. And I think we're going to show a few of these pieces in the video without saying anything about anyone's piece specifically. I will say, look for the bands. There are 3 bands. They're done in different ways. Every painting doesn't look like it is like a variation of the last painting. They all try to do them so that each of them looks individually. That's something I liked about Paul Klee very much, was that every painting he made, even though they do have some similarities, each one has got its own personality, and rather than just being a clone of the last one. So you'll see that in this series, and you'll see that I'm thinking of the 31 days as like a collection of poems. So it's one piece. So it's going to be a little bit hard in terms of the business of art, because people are always wanting to break up the pieces, and I've had to do that one time where a gallery supported me through some hard times and advanced me money against sales. And then, of course, I said, none of these, I'm not selling any of these, and of course that's the ones they wanted. And so 2 or 3 of them went overseas to embassies in Africa. So a couple from the series, but I repainted variations of them and put them back sort of in the 31 days. So, of course, they want to break it up, but I really see it as a whole. And I discovered this, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, is that when I first showed, I had a series in April called Days of April. When I first showed the work, a lot of people were interested in it. They thought it was good, but they also felt it sort of felt familiar. So it didn't have like a kind of shock value like something novel would have. And part of the reason it doesn't feel unfamiliar is because I'm taking like a thread in common from various languages, and I'm weaving them together, not in a collage form, but in a form sort of like maybe the way you would think Mozart putting a piece together with various voices in the conversation, without me assuming really any one of the voices, but also being part of the voice, like I facilitate the conversation as a painter. So these pieces are meant to kind of speak to each other. And I was talking to several of the people who have represented me, and they have represented some really amazing artists. And I was fortunate to work with them. And one of them, Nina Nielsen, who happens to be a Mendelssohn, and part of the artistic Mendelssohn family. Their family is also German Jewish bankers, and her family's, she's related to the composer Mendelssohn, and they're family friends with Goethe, and Bach was really reintroduced by the Mendelssohn composer. She said to me that you might have to write about your own work so that people will understand what it is that they're seeing, or you could make more works that in a sense explain themselves to each other and themselves to the viewer. So if you put more than one together, like in a group, like I've done in the Days of May, that as you start to see what I choose and not choose and how I put them together, that you might, hopefully, people are starting to see it this way. You will see that this isn't like appropriation or a following of something, but it's an attempt to create a conversation between different visual languages, and hopefully within yourself, like an alternative to a sort of a dialectic idea of synthesis, thesis and antithesis synthesis. So an idea where it doesn't necessarily depend on the anti portion of it, that we can kind of work together as a group, like sort of like I know it's a little bit, I hesitate to even say it, but sort of like the American project, like we're sort of many in one kind of idea. And that's why I didn't want to use collage, is I didn't want you to get the idea that, the many, that comes, like Picasso uses this multiple language thing in a single piece in a lot of his work, but this I wanted to be so that it felt like seamless.
Might you, for instance, one of these pieces, read some of Borges' Fiction before you do a particular piece, or not?
No, I didn't. Something I discovered along the way, you're going to have to be careful because this could extend past, I'll say one thing, I guess. So a question I have, I'm going to open up to like whoever's listening to this about how this artist thinks. So I say to myself, okay, so abstract expressionists are always saying everything is about color and color and feeling. So why is it, no matter what way you paint, that color is always associated with feeling? What is up with that? And why is it with most abstract expressionist work that say, well, maybe this is about anger, but all of the paintings seem then like they're about anger? What is up with that? And so a couple things that I started to understand actually through studying Albers a bit was that color is contextual. So he's often misunderstood as having a color theory. It's not really a theory. He's basically saying that you can't understand color unless you have it in relationship to something else or to another color. So it's always changing, and because of that, it's hard to systematize. It can be, but it's hard. It's kind of like life in the sense that it always wants to break free and do its own thing. And so color is contextual, and so is emotion. So sometimes I would say, to a student, here's a story. I say to a student, if I walk in here and I'm really angry at you because you're not showing up for class, and you showed up for class today, and I get really angry, and you haven't been showing up for class, but today you did, but I come in and I get angry about that, you're not going, that emotion is not going to ring authentic. And in a sense there, I'm sort of acting. But if you didn't come to class and you came really late and I got angry at you, about not coming to class in time, you'd understand that as feeling. And color is like that. So, if you put a color into play in relationship to its surroundings, then it has a better chance of coming across as pure feeling, rather than if you applied a sort of symbolic idea, which is another way to use color, is to let the color find its emotion. Then the more complex thing about emotion in, say, painting or other works of art is that in India they have an idea, I can't remember the word, but it is an aesthetic emotion, which is an emotion that is a constellation of emotions. So like when you're making a work of art, you probably can live a whole life in a work of art as you're making it. And so the emotions that usually arise out of a painting is like not a single emotion, but a constellation of emotions. And so you understand it in a sort of different kind of terms, like I was talking about a little earlier, like time with depth. It's like you see it as an amalgamation of things, and that's what I'm hoping to do with my Days of May series, is that you see together, that you will see what the meaning is, where you might not pick it up in the particular painting to painting, but as a whole, you start to get the idea of what I'm working on and why it might be interesting.
Well, if they reproduce well, though, then they could be a book.
Yes, we're actually, the gallery in New York and I have not talked for quite a while about this, but an earlier conversation had mentioned the possibility of that. So I hope that happens.
Well, we hope so, because we won't be able to buy the whole series.
Right.
So.
It's only one piece, so it should be talk a little bit about
Your student days.
Well, you want to talk about
I have a
Lester
painting.
Johnson
I have
here?
a painting that is, I found out from you, has quite a backstory that I didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you would, I'd like to have you talk about it. It has to do with, as I understand it, Lester Johnson, who was a well-regarded artist as well as a professor of yours at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you talk about my painting for a bit.
Okay. So I did a series of paintings, and this one actually was the first one. So my mentor here at Augustana, Carl Grupp, was a great admirer, as many of his peers from Minneapolis, of the artist Lester Johnson, who was a St. Paul, Minneapolis artist that went to New York. And when I was his student, he was sort of had been lifted up because in the early to mid 80s, art movement called Neo-Expressionism was kind of the vanguard movement. And Lester Johnson and George McNeil and Red Grooms, a few other artists, were considered to be like the fathers and grandmothers of the Neo-Expressionist movement. And so also Carl had given me like about 20 years of Art News and Art in America magazines, and I had been in some boxes that he of course didn't want to carry around anymore, but it was like a treasure trove for me, because it kind of gave me a perspective on artists who were really, popular at one time, and then over the course of time they just sort of disappeared. Lester Johnson was someone who was constantly in those magazines over the years, and so knowing Carl's love for him, knowing some of Lester's early work, and the fact that at the graduate school at that time, the walls in the graduate studios only came up like 8 feet. There was a couple feet beyond that at open air. So on the studio on either side of you, you could hear the critique that was being given to the students on either side of you, which was actually also learning vicariously, which is another whole thing in itself. So I would hear Lester speaking to the student on the other side of me, giving him the most marvelous critiques. So I was anxious. I finally was able to get on his list so I could see him in my studio. I was excited. He came to my studio and he looked around and not saying anything. Of course, that makes you a little bit nervous. Silence is always a little bit nerve-wracking. And he sits down with me and he says, "You're Jim, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I understand you're from out west." And I said, "Yes, I'm from South Dakota." And he just nods. And he said, "I don't really know if you're the best artist who's come through here or the worst." He said, "I'd like you to do me a favor. I'd like you to paint me a cliché. And if you can do that well, I'll know the answer to my question." And so I thought it through. I asked him, I said, "So like cliché, what do you mean by cliché?" And he says, like you're from out west, like a barn, or like a set of, like a barbed wire fence going along the road off into the distance and a sunset. Or like out here, maybe some rocks by the ocean in a lighthouse. And I said, "Okay, I think I get it." He says, "Paint me a cliché and we'll see what happens." And so I do. I really wrestle with, well, what should I do? And so, before he left, I said, so like a cliché, like if I paint a sunset, that would be like a cliché. He says, "Yeah, paint a sunset. You know that." And I said, "Yeah, I know that." So I decided, like, what am I going to do? So I had this little square painting. I said, that's an unusual format for a landscape. And so, like, I'll start there. I'll, like, see if I can go against the cliché. So what out west, like the sun, is like the whole thing, like at the sunset, like it's really big. But what if I made it like as big, almost as big as the whole painting? And I made the landscape really small, like say in a Turner painting, like a William Turner painting, watercolor or oil painting of a romantic space. And so I'll paint the landscape, but I'm only gonna like give it like half an inch or something on the bottom of the painting. And then I'm gonna paint the sky lifting up, and this thing is gonna be just fill in the sky. And so then I said, well, okay, now that I got that idea, so what should I do in terms of color? So the obvious thing to do would be to paint it red. So I was just taking a color class for the first time, like the Elbers class, and I thought, okay, what if I made the sky and I painted the base of the painting, the main color of the background, army green, instead of like blue or, some sky color. So the base of that is like an army green, and then it has a little bit of blue work mixed in. And then I'll take manganese violet, not red, and I'll paint the sun. And I won't paint it like a disc, I'll paint it like an orb, and which I did in this painting. And I think they're going to show it maybe at the end here, but I painted as an orb, and the manganese violet, if in this context, should glow out more red. It seems like it did a little bit more, so it looks like the certain violets blew over time, so that looks like it had blued a little bit. So I made the painting, put it up on the wall. I invited Lester to come back in to see me. And he comes back into my studio. He said, "Did you finish the painting?" I said, "I did, Lester. It's this one on the wall." And he looked at the painting for a long time. It probably wasn't that long, but 2, 3, 5 minutes can feel like an eternity. Not saying a word. And he looks at me and he says, "I have nothing to teach you." And he walks out. And so it kind of left me hanging, and I remembered thinking to myself, is this all there is? This is I came here and all the way across the country to learn that they have nothing to teach me. And so anyway, interesting, he left it there. And I did learn an amazing lesson from that project. And I talked to Lester. I took a drawing class from him. I said, well, if he's not going to talk to me in my studio, I'll take drawing from him and he'll have to deal with me. So he did. He taught a marvelous drawing class, which I learned a lot from. So I talked to Lester in a private moment about this, why he said that to me. And he said that, he explained it in a sort of cryptic way. He says, how many lighthouse paintings have you seen? I said, probably hundreds, thousands. He said, how many do you remember that are really great paintings? I said, like 2 or 3, 4. And he said, well, there's 5 or 6 of them. And he said, 3 of them are painted by Edward Hopper. And he said, so why is it that, this painting, there's been so many paintings made of it, but only 3, 4, 5 of them are any good? That's why I asked you to paint a cliché. I wanted to see what you would do with it. Would you actually paint an actual cliché, or would you transcend the cliché and make a painting that had some kind of resonance? He didn't tell me whether he thought it had resonance or not, but I just made up in my own mind that but the fact that he walked out and said, I have nothing to teach you, I thought that was probably, I guess you could take that both ways, couldn't you?
I don't think so. I'd take it positively.
Yeah.
I would say this, you've taught us a lot today. I could listen to you for a long time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And thanks you, Larry, and some of my friends here in South Dakota for all of your support. You've helped me and live a life as an artist.